People in my neighborhood know me as the quiet old man who waters his tomatoes at 6 in the morning and waves at joggers from his porch. My name is Frank Delgado, 73 years old, retired Army Master Sergeant, living the same modest life I've lived for the last decade in a small subdivision outside Tucson, Arizona. Most of my neighbors are retirees too, fixed incomes, small pensions, the kind of people who clip coupons not because they're desperate, but because it's how their generation was raised. I never expected one of them to become the target of my own son-in-law. I should tell you a little about how I got here, because it matters for what comes later. I enlisted at 19, 3 months after my father passed from a heart attack in our kitchen in Yuma. There wasn't much keeping me in that town after that, no scholarship waiting, no trade apprenticeship, just a mother working 2 jobs and a younger sister who needed someone stable in her life. The Army gave me that stability, and in return I gave it 18 years, most of them in logistics and supply chain operations, which sounds unglamorous until you understand what it actually means. It means learning to track every dollar, every pallet, every signature on every requisition form, because in the field, a missing crate of medical supplies or a falsified fuel manifest isn't a paperwork error. It's a life on the line. I spent 2 decades learning to notice what didn't add up before it became a catastrophe. I met my wife Rosa at a base commissary in El Paso in 1979. She was a civilian employee, sharp-tongued, unimpressed by my uniform, which is exactly why I fell for her. We married a year later and had our daughter Claudia in 1985. Rosa passed 9 years ago from ovarian cancer, and I won't dwell on that here except to say that losing her taught me something about grief that I carry into every relationship since. It taught me that the people you love deserve your full attention while you still have it, not just your good intentions. After I retired from the Army, Rosa and I settled in this house outside Tucson. I picked up small mechanical work for neighbors, nothing formal, just the kind of favor economy that exists in retirement communities where everyone's trying to stretch a pension a little further. After Rosa passed, I kept doing it, partly because I needed something to do with my hands, and partly because it kept me connected to people instead of disappearing into my own grief the way some widowers do. Claudia grew up watching her mother and me build something steady out of very little. She became a nurse practitioner, married young to a good man named Miguel who died in a construction accident when she was 31, leaving her alone with a mortgage and no children yet, thank God, though she'd wanted them badly. She grieved hard, harder than I think I ever fully understood at the time, because I was still deep in my own grief over Rosa and didn't have much left over to give her. That's something I've had to make peace with since, the fact that grief in a family doesn't always arrive in a way that lets people support each other. Sometimes it just leaves everyone alone in their own room, listening to the walls. 4 years ago, Claudia started seeing a man named Preston Cole. She met him at a fundraising gala for a children's hospital, the kind of event she attended occasionally through her nursing network. Preston ran something he called a community outreach foundation, polished website, glossy brochures, a logo that looked expensive, the kind of nonprofit branding that costs real money to produce. He talked about helping seniors avoid financial scams, funding meal deliveries for shut-ins, organizing free legal clinics for people who couldn't afford an attorney. On paper, it sounded like exactly the kind of work a retired logistics sergeant like me would respect, the kind of quiet, unglamorous service that doesn't make headlines but keeps a community's most vulnerable people from falling through the cracks. The first time I met Preston, at a dinner Claudia arranged at her house, he shook my hand a little too firmly and said, "Frank, I've heard you're a man who values seeing where every dollar goes. I like that. Transparency is everything in my line of work." I remember thinking, even then, that's a strange thing to volunteer before anyone's asked. Guilty men and honest men both talk about transparency, but only one of them needs to bring it up before anyone's questioned him. For the first year, I kept my distance the way I usually do with my daughter's partners, giving them room to build their own relationship without an old man hovering with opinions. Not because I disliked Preston. He was polite, attentive to Claudia in public, always remembered my birthday with a card that had clearly been picked out by someone who paid attention to details. But something about the way he talked about his foundation felt rehearsed, like a man reciting a speech rather than describing his life's work. I've sat across from enough contractors and vendors in my army days to recognize the difference between someone explaining their genuine passion and someone performing confidence for an audience. They married 2 years after they met, a small ceremony at a vineyard outside Sonoita that Preston insisted on paying for entirely, which struck me as generous at the time and only later struck me as a pattern, this compulsive need to be seen as the provider, the benefactor, the man whose name appeared first on every check. For the first 2 years of their marriage, small things bothered me quietly, the way small things always do before they become large things. I noticed Preston never let Claudia handle foundation business alone when I was around, always inserting himself into conversations about the organization's finances with a level of control that seemed less like partnership and more like management of a narrative. I noticed he corrected small details about the foundation's work whenever Claudia described it to family, gently, always gently, followed by a laugh that made it seem inconsequential. That's not quite the current numbers, babe, let me explain it better. Small corrections, small assertions of ownership over information that, technically, should have belonged to both of them equally if the marriage was truly a partnership. I mentioned none of this to Claudia. What would I have said? My father-in-law instincts were pattern matching against 30 years of watching men perform confidence in briefing rooms, but pattern matching isn't proof, and I've learned the hard way, in the army and out of it, that accusing someone based on a feeling rather than evidence destroys trust faster than almost anything else. So I watched, and I waited, and I told myself I was simply being an overprotective father who hadn't fully adjusted to sharing his daughter with another man's household. Then, about 8 months ago, everything changed on an ordinary Tuesday morning while I was fixing my sprinkler line. My neighbor Arlene Whitfield, 81 years old, a widow who's lived 2 houses down from me for the better part of 11 years, leaned over the low fence between our properties while I knelt in the dirt with a wrench. Arlene and I have a comfortable, unremarkable friendship built on the kind of small daily kindnesses that develop between neighbors who've watched each other grow old, borrowed tools, shared tomatoes, the occasional ride to a doctor's appointment when her daughter couldn't make it from Phoenix in time. "That nice foundation your son-in-law runs," she said, adjusting her sun hat, "they called me last week. Said I qualified for a special senior grant, $500, but I needed to pay a small processing fee first to release the funds." My hands went still on the sprinkler valve. I didn't look up right away, because I've learned that the moment you show someone you've noticed something wrong, they either stop talking or start performing an explanation instead of telling you the truth. "How much was the fee, Arlene?" "Just $75, she said, entirely unbothered, the way people are when they haven't yet realized they've been taken advantage of. Seemed reasonable for $500 back, especially with my property taxes going up again this year. I asked, as casually as I could manage, whether she'd paid it. She had, 3 days earlier, using a gift card she'd bought at the pharmacy, exactly as the caller had instructed her to do. Gift cards. I want to explain why that single detail mattered so much to me, because it's the kind of thing that seems small to someone who hasn't spent a career around fraud investigations and supply chains. Legitimate organizations, government agencies, actual charities, they simply do not request payment via gift card. It's not how invoicing works, it's not how grant disbursement works, it's not how any legitimate financial transaction is structured. Gift cards are the preferred instrument of scammers specifically because they're untraceable and irreversible the moment the numbers on the back are read aloud over a phone line. 18 years of Army logistics teaches you to recognize the shape of a transaction designed to disappear, and this had that shape unmistakably. I didn't say anything to Arlene about my suspicions yet. I've learned that the worst thing you can do when someone's been victimized is make them feel foolish before you've confirmed anything, because shame shuts people down faster than almost any other emotion, and I needed her to keep talking, not retreat into embarrassment. I simply asked, gently, "Did they give you a name, the person who called?" She remembered, after some thought, a woman who'd introduced herself as Denise, from something called the Cole Community Foundation Senior Grants Division. My stomach tightened at the word Cole. It could have been a coincidence. Cole isn't an especially rare surname. But combined with the phrase senior grants, which sounded suspiciously close to the kind of language Preston used when he described his foundation's mission, it was enough to make the back of my neck prickle with an old, familiar wariness. Over the following 2 weeks, I did something I hadn't done since my last few years of active duty. I quietly gathered intelligence rather than raising alarms. I asked around the neighborhood, discreetly, framing my questions as idle concern rather than investigation. I visited with Walter Simmons, a retired postal worker 3 streets over who'd lost his wife the same year I lost Rosa, and who I knew received similar scam calls occasionally because we'd commiserated about robocalls at a barbecue the previous summer. Walter, it turned out, had received a nearly identical call 2 months earlier, though he'd been suspicious enough not to pay anything. He still had the confirmation email sitting unread in his inbox, and when he pulled it up on his ancient desktop computer, I saw immediately what I was looking for. The email used a logo nearly identical to Preston's actual foundation's branding, the same shade of blue, the same stylized handshake icon, just slightly altered, cropped differently, as though someone had taken the original artwork and modified it just enough to avoid being an exact copy while still trading on the recognition value of the real thing. I found 2 more neighbors over the following 10 days who'd received similar calls. Dolores Vance, a widow on the cul-de-sac, had actually blocked the number after growing suspicious, but she remembered the caller mentioning a $500 senior wellness grant tied to veteran family outreach, a detail that made my jaw tighten because it suggested whoever was running this operation knew enough about Preston's actual foundation to weave in specific, plausible-sounding program names. And a retired schoolteacher named Harold Fenwick, 2 blocks over, had paid the $75 fee just like Arlene, using a gift card exactly as instructed, and had never received his promised $500, though he'd been too embarrassed to mention it to anyone until I asked him directly. 4 victims in one small subdivision, all elderly, all on fixed incomes, all approached with the same script, always a small grant promised, always a processing fee required in untraceable gift cards, always mentioning some version of Preston's foundation name or its programs. This wasn't random. This was targeted, and it was targeting people I'd known for years, people who trusted the name Cole because it was connected, through my daughter, to their own community. I didn't confront Preston directly. Not yet. Instead, I did what 18 years of logistics work trained me to do above all else. I built an unimpeachable paper trail before I said a single word out loud, because in my experience, accusations without documentation simply become his word against yours, and men like Preston, articulate, confident, practiced at controlling narratives, always win that particular argument if it's allowed to remain a matter of competing stories rather than verifiable facts. I asked Arlene for the exact phone number that had called her, and she found it in her call log, a number with an area code that traced, when I looked it up online, to a prepaid phone service based out of state, the kind of untraceable burner line that legitimate businesses never use. I asked Walter for a printed copy of his confirmation email, and I sat with it at my kitchen table for nearly an hour under a magnifying glass I still had from my model building hobby, comparing every pixel of that logo against a printout of Preston's actual foundation website. Then I drove the 2 hours to the county courthouse and requested the public nonprofit filing for the Cole Community Foundation, the actual legal entity Preston had registered. The filing was legitimate, registered 3 years earlier, small but real annual revenue reported, a real board of directors, real tax documentation. But the senior grants division that had called my neighbors, the specific program name mentioned in every single call, wasn't listed anywhere in the official filing. It didn't exist as a legal program under the real foundation. It was a separate operation entirely, using Preston's real foundation's name and branding to appear legitimate, while funneling gift card payments through phone numbers and processing systems that traced back, as far as I could determine from public records alone, to a prepaid phone service with no listed business address. I sat in my truck in the courthouse parking lot for a long while after that, engine off, hands on the wheel, thinking about my daughter asleep beside a man who either knew about this or had been so carelessly inattentive to his own organization's name and reputation that 4 of my neighbors had been robbed using his good name as bait. Neither possibility sat easily with me. I called an old friend from my logistics days, a woman named Denise Whitaker, and yes, I noticed the coincidence of her first name matching the scammer's alias immediately, a small dark joke that almost made me laugh despite the gravity of the situation. Denise and I had served together for 6 years, back when she was a young logistics officer I'd mentored, and she'd gone on after her own 22 years of service to become a fraud investigator for the State Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division, a job that suited her meticulous, unforgiving attention to detail perfectly. I sent her everything I'd gathered, Arlene's phone records, Walter's confirmation email with its subtly altered logo, the courthouse filings showing the legitimate foundation's actual registered programs, and screenshots I'd managed to find of the Senior Grants Division's web page, buried 3 link clicks deep from Preston's real foundation site, clearly designed to be difficult for a casual visitor to stumble upon but easy enough for someone actively searching to eventually locate. "Frank," she said, calling me back after reviewing everything for 2 full days, her voice carrying the particular flatness she used when she was genuinely troubled by something. "This is textbook elder fraud, dressed up carefully to look connected to a real, legitimate charity. Whoever's running the Senior Grants Division either works for your son-in-law directly, has access to his branding and marketing materials, or he's looking the other way while it happens under his organization's name. I don't see a fourth option here." I asked her the question that had been sitting in my chest for 2 weeks like a stone. Could he not know? Could this be happening without his knowledge? Denise was quiet for a moment. "It's possible, Frank. Foundations get their branding stolen and misused more often than people realize. But for victims in one small subdivision, all connected to you, his own father-in-law, that's not random misuse. That's either an inside job by someone with access to his materials, or willful blindness on his part because looking too closely might reveal something he doesn't want to find. Either way, it needs to stop, and it needs official eyes on it now, not just yours." 3 weeks after Arlene first mentioned the phone call, I brought it up at a family dinner at my house. Claudia had made pot roast, the same recipe her mother Rosa used to make from a recipe card so worn the handwriting had nearly faded to nothing, and the smell of it filled the kitchen the way it always had on Sunday evenings when Rosa was still alive. Preston was mid-sentence about a new expansion initiative for the foundation, talking animatedly about a potential partnership with the regional hospital system, when I set my fork down deliberately on the edge of my plate. "Preston," I said, keeping my voice as calm and conversational as I could manage, "tell me about your senior grants division." His fork paused halfway to his mouth, just for a fraction of a second, but I'd spent 30 years reading micro-expressions in briefing rooms where a flicker of hesitation could mean the difference between a soldier telling you the truth and a soldier telling you what he thought you wanted to hear. "We don't have a division by that name, Frank," he said, setting his fork down with deliberate casualness. I nodded slowly, giving him every opportunity to keep talking, to fill the silence the way guilty people often do when they're not sure how much you already know. "Then maybe you can explain," I said, "why 4 of my neighbors, people I've known for years, got calls from a group using your foundation's exact logo, asking for gift card payments to release grant money from a program that doesn't officially exist." Claudia's face went pale in a way I'll remember for a long time, the particular color drain of someone realizing a foundation of trust beneath them has just cracked. "Preston, what is he talking about?" Preston's easy charm, the confident, articulate demeanor he'd worn like a well-tailored suit for the entire 4 years I'd known him, cracked visibly for the first time. There might be some affiliate marketing partners who've used our brand loosely without full authorization, but I don't control every entity that references our name in the "Save it," I said quietly, sliding a manila folder across the table, the same measured, unhurried motion I'd learned decades earlier that landed harder than any raised voice ever could. Inside were the courthouse filings, Arlene's phone records with the burner number highlighted, Walter's confirmation email printed alongside a side-by-side comparison with the real foundation's actual logo, and a 2-page summary Denise Whitaker had prepared, outlining the pattern of fraud in clinical, damning language. Preston stared at the folder for a long moment without touching it, as though not opening it might somehow prevent its contents from being real. "Frank, I swear I didn't personally." "I didn't say you personally called anyone," I said. "I said your brand, your logo, and your foundation's good name are being used to steal money from 80-year-old widows living on fixed incomes, and you've known something was off for months, Preston, because Arlene isn't the first neighbor who's mentioned strange calls at your own family barbecues. I remember you laughing it off at 4th of July, telling Dolores it was probably just a scammer copying popular charity names and there wasn't much anyone could do about it. You knew this was happening under your name, and you decided it wasn't worth investigating." The silence that settled over that dinner table lasted longer than any silence I've sat through since my years overseas, and I've sat through some genuinely terrible silences in my life, the kind that follow bad news delivered to a soldier's family, the kind that follow a diagnosis nobody wants to hear. Claudia finally spoke, her voice shaking in a way that broke something in my chest. "Is that true? Did you know about this?" Preston's shoulders sank, the performance finally, fully abandoning him. "I suspected something. A former business partner, a man named Corbin Reyes who helped set up our original marketing materials before we parted ways over a financial disagreement 2 years back, still had access to some of our old branding templates. I found out about 6 months ago that he'd started some kind of side operation using pieces of our old materials. I told myself it wasn't really my problem to solve, that it was probably small scale, that it would burn itself out. It became your problem," I said, "the moment your name and your wife's family became connected to it." and it became my problem the moment it started targeting people who live within walking distance of my own front door. I turned to Claudia, softening my voice as much as I could manage while still being direct. I'm not telling you what to do about your marriage. That's not my place, and I won't pretend it is. But these are my neighbors, Claudia. People who trusted a name because it was attached, through you, to my own family. The week following that dinner unfolded with a kind of grim momentum I recognized from my army days, the sensation of a slow-moving investigation suddenly gathering speed once the first solid piece of evidence falls into place. Denise Whitaker filed a formal complaint with the State Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division the following Monday morning, attaching every document I'd gathered, and within days the case had been assigned an official file number, which felt, strangely, like the first real validation that this wasn't simply an old man's suspicious hunch. Preston, to his credit in that first difficult week, didn't retreat into denial the way I half expected him to. Whatever else I came to think of him over the following months, he did eventually choose cooperation over concealment, though it took Claudia sitting him down the night after our dinner confrontation and telling him, in words she later shared with me, that she would not remain married to a man who chose his own comfort over the well-being of people who trusted his name. The name Corbin Reyes, the former business partner Preston had mentioned, became the center of Denise's investigation almost immediately. Corbin, it turned out, had co-founded the original Coal Community Foundation with Preston 5 years earlier, back when the organization was smaller, more grassroots, before Preston had secured additional funding and expanded operations. Their falling out, according to Preston, had been over exactly the kind of dispute that plants the seeds for exactly the sort of scheme. Corbin had wanted to monetize the foundation's growing donor list more aggressively, running paid seminars and financial products alongside the charitable work, and Preston had refused, insisting on maintaining a clean separation between the nonprofit's mission and any for-profit ventures. Corbin left angry, taking with him, apparently, digital copies of branding materials, logo files, email templates, and enough institutional knowledge of how the Foundation's legitimate senior outreach programs actually work to construct a convincing fraudulent mirror of it. Denise's team traced the burner phone service to a virtual number provider, which required a subpoena to unmask, a process that took nearly 3 weeks and tested my patience in a way that reminded me uncomfortably of waiting on slow-moving supply requisitions overseas, watching good intentions get strangled by bureaucratic pacing while real people continued to suffer in the interim. During those 3 weeks, 2 more victims came forward from neighboring subdivisions, people who'd seen a local news segment Denise's office had arranged about a suspected elder fraud scheme operating in the greater Tucson area, a deliberately vague public warning designed to surface additional victims without tipping off Corbin Reyes that investigators were closing in on a specific name. I want to be honest about something during this period, because it would be dishonest to pretend my relationship with Preston simply repaired itself smoothly once the investigation began. There were weeks of real tension in our family. Claudia moved back into my house for 11 days during the worst of it, not because Preston had done anything to her directly, but because she needed distance to think clearly about what she'd learned, about a husband who'd known, for 6 months, that something connected to his name was hurting elderly people, and had decided it wasn't his problem to fix. I remember one particular evening during those 11 days, sitting on my back porch with Claudia while the desert cooled around us, the cicadas working themselves into their evening chorus. She asked me, quietly, whether I thought she should leave her marriage entirely. "I can't answer that for you," I told her honestly. I learned a long time ago, watching men make decisions in situations far less personal than this one, that the question isn't just what someone did wrong. It's what they do once they know it's wrong. Preston didn't create Corbyn's scheme. He didn't personally call Arlene or Walter or Harold. But he let a version of willful blindness sit in his chest for 6 months because looking closely might have cost him something: comfort, maybe a legal headache, maybe just the unpleasant work of confronting an old friend turned adversary. That's a real failure, Claudia, and you're allowed to decide it's disqualifying. But it's also the kind of failure a lot of decent people are capable of when the cost of doing the right thing feels inconvenient enough. The question is whether, now that it's actually costing him something, he does the harder right thing or keeps finding reasons to minimize it. Claudia sat with that for a long while before answering. He's been different this week, she finally said. Scared, mostly. But also, I think, actually ashamed, not just embarrassed. There's a difference, and I think I can tell them apart now. I didn't tell her what to do with that observation. That wasn't my place, and I'd meant what I said about it not being my decision to make. But I watched, over the following weeks, as Preston made a series of choices that suggested Claudia's read on him wasn't entirely wrong. When investigators finally unmasked the burner phone service's billing information, it led, unsurprisingly, to Corbyn Reyes, operating out of a small rented office space 40 minutes away in a strip mall that also housed a tax preparation service and a vacant storefront that had once been a video rental store, the kind of location chosen specifically because it would attract no scrutiny. Corbyn had, according to the eventual forensic accounting, defrauded at least 11 victims across 3 different subdivisions over a period of approximately 5 months, totaling just over $63,000 in stolen processing fees, an amount that sounds almost quaint compared to the scale of some financial fraud I'd read about in the news, until you remember that every single victim was a person on a fixed income who could genuinely not afford to lose $75 or $100, let alone the recurring additional processing fees Corbyn's operation had extracted from several victims who'd been called back a second and third time with new excuses for why their promised grant money hadn't yet arrived. Preston, once the investigation reached this point, did something that genuinely surprised me. Rather than simply cooperating with the minimum required by law, he voluntarily opened his foundation's complete financial and marketing records to Denise's investigators, waiving attorney-client privilege on several internal communications that his own lawyer had advised him to keep protected. He also, entirely on his own initiative, established an emergency restitution fund from the foundation's discretionary reserves, personally reimbursing every identified victim the full amount they'd lost, before the state's own restitution process had even been finalized, a decision that cost him, by his own later admission to me, nearly $40,000 of the foundation's operating budget for that year. I asked him, some weeks later, once things had settled into a more stable rhythm, why he'd made that choice rather than simply waiting for the legal process to run its course and potentially recover the money from Corbyn directly. Because Arlene Whitfield is 75 and living on a fixed income who trusted my name, he said, and there was something raw in his voice that hadn't been there during our earlier conversations, something that had finally cracked through the polished, rehearsed quality I'd noticed in him from our very first meeting. I don't need the state's timeline to tell me that's wrong. I've known it was wrong for 6 months, and I chose comfort over confronting it. The least I owe these people now is not making them wait for a court process to get their money back. Corbyn Reyes was formally charged the following month with wire fraud, elder financial abuse, and identity-related offenses connected to his unauthorized use of the foundation's branding, charges that carried, given the number of victims and the deliberate targeting of elderly people, the possibility of substantial prison time. His defense attorney, in a detail that struck me as almost darkly comic, attempted initially to argue that Corbyn had simply been running an aggressive but legal donor engagement program, an argument that collapsed almost immediately once the gift card payment structure and the complete absence of any legitimate grant disbursement came under scrutiny. The case never went to a full jury trial. Corbyn accepted a plea agreement roughly 4 months after the investigation began, pleading guilty to reduced charges in exchange for a sentence of 3 years, along with a restitution order that, realistically, everyone involved understood he had little capacity to actually pay given his financial situation, which is precisely why Preston's voluntary reimbursement to the victims mattered so much in practical terms, real money in real people's hands, rather than a court judgment against a man with no meaningful assets. I want to tell you about the day Preston's foundation held what they called a community trust rebuilding event, 6 months after the whole ordeal began, because it's the moment that finally shifted something in how I saw him, not as a redeemed man exactly. Redemption isn't really a single moment, it's a sustained pattern of choices, but as someone genuinely trying to become the man his original mission statement had claimed he already was. The event was small, held in the community center a few blocks from my house, the same building where Arlene played bridge on Tuesday afternoons and where Walter's grandchildren attended a summer reading program. Preston stood in front of maybe 40 people, mostly the victims and their families, along with a handful of state investigators and a local reporter who'd covered the original fraud story. "I'm not going to stand up here and ask you to trust me again just because I'm saying the right words," Preston said, and I remember being struck by how much less polished he sounded than he had at that very first dinner 4 years earlier, less like a man performing sincerity and more like someone genuinely uncertain of his own footing. Trust isn't rebuilt with a speech. It's rebuilt over years, through consistent action, and I understand if some of you in this room aren't ready to extend that to me yet, or ever. What I can tell you is what's changed. Every program under this foundation's name now has a public, auditable registry, updated monthly, cross-referenced with state nonprofit filings, so that anyone, anywhere, can verify in 30 seconds whether a call claiming to represent us is legitimate. I've hired an independent compliance officer, someone with no personal loyalty to me, whose entire job is to flag exactly the kind of blind spot I allowed to exist for 6 months. And I want to specifically thank someone who isn't going to want this thanks, because he'd rather be home watering his tomatoes than standing in a spotlight. He looked directly at me then, and I felt Claudia's hand find mine where I sat beside her. My father-in-law, Frank Delgado, spent 3 weeks of his own time building the case that exposed this fraud, using skills he developed over 18 years in Army logistics that I genuinely didn't know he had until he laid a folder on my dinner table and calmly asked me to explain myself. He didn't do it because he had any obligation to protect my foundation's reputation. He did it because his neighbors were being hurt, and he was paying closer attention than I was to the people my organization is supposed to serve. I owe him, and I owe every person in this room, more than an apology. I owe you the ongoing work of actually earning back what was lost. I didn't say much in response when people turned to look at me, beyond a brief nod, because that's not really who I am, standing up and accepting applause for doing what any decent person should do when they notice their neighbors are being harmed. But I'll admit there was something quietly satisfying in watching Arlene, sitting 2 rows ahead of me, turn around with tears in her eyes and mouth the words "thank you" before facing forward again. Claudia and Preston are still married today, and I won't pretend their marriage simply returned to whatever it had been before all this happened. Claudia told me, some months later, that she and Preston had spent considerable time in counseling working through what she described as the difference between loving someone and fully trusting someone, a distinction she said she hadn't fully understood before this ordeal forced her to examine it. Their marriage now, as far as I can observe as her father, involves a level of transparency about the foundation's finances that didn't exist before, Claudia sits on the organization's board now, with full access to every account and every program, a role Preston himself insisted on establishing, telling her, according to what she shared with me, that he never wanted to be in a position again where willful blindness could quietly take root in his decision-making without someone he trusted. Completely watching closely enough to catch it early. Arlene Whitfield knocked on my door about a month after the Community Trust rebuilding event, holding a small tin of her homemade oatmeal cookies, the same recipe she'd been bringing to neighborhood gatherings for as long as I've known her. "I heard everything that happened," she said, settling into the chair on my porch that's become, over the years, unofficially hers whenever she visits. "Nobody else in this neighborhood would have caught what you caught, Frank. I want you to know that." I told her the truth, the same thing I've come to believe more firmly with each passing year of my retirement. "I didn't catch it because I'm smarter than anyone else around here, Arlene. I caught it because 18 years of my life were spent learning that the people most likely to be targeted by exactly this kind of scheme are precisely the people everyone else assumes are too trusting, or too old, or too out of touch to protect themselves. That assumption is the vulnerability scammers exploit, and it's the same assumption that almost let this go unnoticed in our own backyard for months." She squeezed my hand before she left that afternoon, the tin of cookies sitting between us on the small table where Rosa and I used to have coffee every morning before she passed. "Well," Arlene said, "I'm just glad someone was paying attention." "So am I, Arlene. So am I. I think often, in the months since all this happened, about what it actually means to be underestimated as you age, and about how that underestimation can cut two ways. It's true that scammers target the elderly precisely because they assume diminished capacity, diminished vigilance, diminished ability to fight back through official channels. But it's equally true that families, communities, even well-meaning younger relatives, often make a parallel mistake, assuming that a quiet retired man who spends his mornings fixing sprinkler lines and waving at joggers has nothing left to offer beyond pleasant company at holiday dinners. Preston himself admitted to me, during a long conversation we had several weeks after the Community Trust event, that he genuinely never considered, in 4 years of knowing me, that the skills I'd spent 18 years developing in Army logistics might one day become directly relevant to protecting his own foundation's integrity. "I saw a retired mechanic-adjacent guy who fixed lawn mowers for the neighborhood," he told me, with something like genuine embarrassment in his voice. "I never once thought to ask what you actually did for a career, or what that career might have taught you about spotting exactly the kind of fraud that eventually happened right under my own name." I don't say this to claim some kind of moral superiority over Preston, or to suggest that his initial underestimation of me was some grave sin. It's an entirely human pattern, the tendency to see people primarily through the role they currently occupy, retired old man, quiet neighbor, rather than the full accumulated weight of what they've lived through and learned along the way. But I do think there's a lesson in it worth naming plainly, for anyone listening who has an aging parent, or grandparent, or neighbor whose current quietness might be obscuring decades of hard-won expertise that could matter more than anyone realizes, right up until the moment it suddenly does. If this story reminded you that the people who seem quiet or overlooked are sometimes the ones paying the closest attention, share it with someone who deserves to hear it. And if it touched you, subscribe for more stories about family, integrity, and the quiet strength it takes to protect the people around you, whether they're the ones you're related to by blood, or simply the ones who happen to live 2 houses down.